Hello and welcome. Yes, this is a casual interview, which I am conducting. I am your host, Betsy Bird, and today it is my very great pleasure to say that we are speaking with M.T. Anderson, author of such YA novels as the Prince Honor Award-winning book Feed and the National Book Award-winning The Astonishing Life of Octavia Nothing, and of course the Jasper Dash series, amongst many others. This we know. What we have a tendency to forget is that the man has also done what very few YA writers have dared. He has also written nonfiction for children. Handel, Who Knew What He Liked, Strange Mr. Sadie. And if Goodreads is to be believed, which it is not, apparently he's the author of the Delicious Desserts Book Pack, delicious and easy cupcake recipes, and I Love Brownies, the world's best brownie recipes. Well done there. It also says that he is the author of The Invisible Man, so there you go. In any case, I am very pleased. You should see the books that you apparently have written, Tobin. They are really ridiculous.
Basketball. It's kind of funny because I really have hardly stirred out of my seat in the last 20 years. But you know, the basketball is out of the court for me. Anyway,
there you go. Exactly. Oh no, there was a mess of nonfiction adult books there that I was just looking at them going, I'm pretty sure he hasn't written that, but maybe he has a side life I don't know anything about. So.
Important. The book about the importance of prayer that apparently comes up under my name, and I'm afraid that's not me either.
Oh, see, now I'm all disappointed. Oh well, maybe you can do the young reader edition. You lucky. You lucky. Okay. If ever this whole writing your own books thing doesn't work out, yeah. So today we are speaking to you about an upcoming book. A book that, according to Goodreads, and we know how reliable that is, the title is Symphony for the Dead. Oh, Symphony for the City of the Dead. Dmitri Shostakovich and the Siege of Leningrad. Is that actually the title?
Yes, that's it. Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Excellent.
It's also the first nonfiction book I've done that is actually longer and for older teens, as opposed to like a picture book. So, yeah.
Okay, that was going to be my first question. Like, who is the audience for this? So this is an older teen book.
Yeah, it's more like for sort of 16 and up, I would say. Just because it's about the whole scene is pretty brutal.
Yes. Well, and I was going to ask you about that, like right from the start. But first, like, why did you write this book?
Well, it's a totally. I'm a music lover, so I really love the music of Shostakovich. So Dmitri Shostakovich is a composer who was stuck inside the city of Leningrad for the beginning of this conflict, which turned out to be one of the longest sieges in human history. And he was there for the beginning of it and actually composed a piece of music largely there while in the city that was being bombed from the air and shelled from across enemy lines and all this kind of thing. And then it was, the symphony was actually then put on microfilm and smuggled out through the Middle East and across Northern Africa, flown to the U.S., where it was performed in New York City, where you yourself are sitting right now. Not, in that room. But
that would be a little shocking. Taken to Harlem.
Especially because it people to play. I assume that would be quite tight seating. Anyway, so it was performed there, and the idea was that it was supposed to actually attract American interest in the Soviet cause, which of course we were, our relations with the Soviets have been quite frosty even before the Second World War. So anyway, it immediately struck me that, I loved his music always, but here was also a story, and I have to admit that the genre fiction writer in me, or the reader of Tintin, was initially excited by that idea of, whoa, a microfilm being, taken around first by airplane and then driven across the sands of the desert and then flown across the pyramids near Cairo, all this kind of thing. But on the microfilm is not like a plan for a secret submarine or, part of the Ultra Code or something, but actually a symphony. And that just struck me as totally fascinating. And so when I heard that story years ago, I started to think about, I wonder what that's all about. So that's where, it really came from. It's just the fact that the story was so bizarre and interesting, and then I happen to love the music too.
Well, it's interesting. When we hear about the Siege of Leningrad, I think I could count all the children's and teen books that are about it, and I think they're none. We got none. Why is
Yeah.
that? I mean, we're talking about. I was talking to my husband about it. It's like, we're talking urban guerrilla fighting, which we have very few books on. It's such a fascinating story in and of itself. Why has nobody covered this before, do you think?
Well, I think it's no one's covered it in this country, and I think that we tend to forget the Russian contribution in World War II, only because of the history of the Cold War afterwards, meant that, Western historians didn't really want to talk much about the Russian contribution, and the Russians certainly didn't want to talk about the American contribution. So there was like this mutual thing where we sort of pretended that the other one hadn't mattered much. But I mean, it's actually incredible the tragic suffering of the Russians during this period is overwhelming. So that, for example, more Soviet citizens died in Leningrad and its surrounds, defending its surroundings for the 3 years or so that the siege went on, then the number of Soviet citizens who died is higher than the number of American citizens who have died in all wars, period.
Whoa.
So just for that area.
Okay. Yeah.
So it really is, and so it's this kind of thing that, like, for us to understand the Second World War, we have to understand the way that the Soviets, were a target of it and fought as part of it, and also how they brought it on themselves to some extent. I mean, that's a glib way of putting it, but the way that Stalin, in particular, allowed things to develop to a point which was truly disastrous. I guess is what I really mean. Anyway, so yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of?
It affected a huge number of people, and so I feel like we should be paying attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what kind of research did you do for this?
Well, all sorts. I mean, it's taken me several years to write the book. I started lightly working on it about 4 years ago, and then really plunged in about 3. And I went to St. Petersburg, which is Leningrad, and then I actually had to hire a research assistant to do the research for me in the Moscow archives because I don't speak Russian, which was, as you can imagine, was a stumbling block. Russian is incredibly hard to learn, I have to admit. It really stumped me. I went over there for almost a month, and and I was trying to pick up phrases and things, but I found it a very difficult language. So, for example, a friend of mine who is Russian pointed out, for example, that the phrase that I was using, my guidebook had said the phrase "I am going to" is this particular thing. So I would say that to all these taxi cab drivers, and they'd always look at me funny. Well, it turned out they were looking at me funny because what I was actually saying is, I am walking to so-and-so. So it's like I would walk up to a cab and say, I am walking to the Hermitage. And they'd be like, okay, have a great time. I hope you enjoy your walk, sir. But seriously, and then a few weeks afterwards, after I came back from there, I actually to Indonesia. And Indonesian was so much easier to learn than Russian. Indonesian I can still remember fragments of. Russian, it is, I am just Russian stupid somehow.
Huh. So your next book is going to be the history of Indonesia then?
No. That was just to get over the fact of having studied, death and cannibalism in the city of Leningrad. I had to go to, Indonesia for a minute to warm up.
So are there no American, dare I say, like adult books on this subject that you had to do so much original research, or were you just being thorough?
There are definitely books for adults on it. Yeah. There definitely are. There are some wonderful books on it. And they also translated some really great diaries from Russian as well. So, no, there was plenty to read. It was partially that certain aspects of the story, like that microfilm transfer I talked about, no one had ever looked into that seriously. before. And this actually is important because I know that you were the head of like nonfiction at for the New York City Public Libraries. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. New York Public
Is
Library.
yeah. So, there's that thing that Mark Aronson said a few years ago that really stuck with me. That idea that that nonfiction for kids should include original research. There used to be this assumption, and there always has been, that it's basically an act of popularization. You know what I mean? That we basically are taking stuff that adults have done for other adults, and then, for an academic audience or whatever, and then we kind of just distill it into a story that people. But Mark, I found it really inspiring when he talked about the idea that these could be books which covered angles that have not been covered in work for adults. So I ended up doing, so the basic story of Shostakovich's life and that kind of thing has been written about, from all sorts of points of view for decades. But the idea of trying to write about this, the microfilm thing and then how that affected American politics, that has not been done. So that a lot of what I was trying to do was actually follow things like expense records to find out if I could trace the route through the Middle East and that kind of thing.
And how did you hear about this in the first place? Like, what got you interested in this from the start?
I don't know, it's the kind of story that people tell, like it's in the notes at symphony concerts and that kind of thing. I don't really remember where I first heard about it. It's, it's just the sort of myths that musicians talk about. And it was interesting to see the parts that were true and the parts that weren't, that kind of thing. But I should mention another cool part of it. There was an article a few years ago that talked in the Guardian in England that talked about an event which was the summer after the symphony was first performed elsewhere. They decided that they had to perform it in Leningrad itself, where it had not been performed before. And Leningrad at this point was in terrible shape. They had a horrible winter where basically all food supplies were cut off, fuel supplies were cut off. It's so far north there that it's only light for a few hours a day. So they had this winter where they had no heat and 20 degrees below zero weather, for a lot of it. There was a real rise in cannibalism. There were all order had broken down in the city, or not all order, but regions of the city order had broken down, and there were sort of like gangs of organized cannibals hunting people and that kind of thing. I mean, really super brutal conditions. And the Germans, incidentally, were at this point calculating how long it would take to starve the city out. They decided they didn't actually want to conquer the city. They wanted everyone in the city to die because they didn't want to have to take prisoners and deal with them. So the point is that in the middle of this, these people in the city decided, well, we have to perform this symphony. So they kind of cobbled together a symphony orchestra, literally by going around from door to door to all of the musicians who were still left in town, because a lot of people had managed to flee before the Germans got there. And they brought them all out, and they were covered in soot, they were emaciated, they were starving to death, and they started to have rehearsals to play first other music, and then it was finally going to be the Shostakovich piece in the summer. But at first they were playing things that they already would have known, like Tchaikovsky and that kind of thing. But I mean, sitting there where they are having these rehearsals, people are literally fainting and collapsing during the rehearsals. And people are unable to lift their arms and that kind of thing. And finally, they worked themselves up to it. Several months after this, they finally had this performance of the Leningrad Symphony, as it was called, the piece that Shostakovich had written mainly in the city of Leningrad. He wrote most of it there before he was airlifted out. So it's called the Leningrad Symphony. And they performed it there. And what they did was they actually had speakers broadcasting it through the city, and then broadcasting it out across no man's land towards the Germans as a big FU. And so the idea was that then, and the head of the army in the area actually bombed the Germans that night on the opposite side of the city, so that there would, to draw the German fire away from the concert hall so the concert wouldn't be interrupted. And so they broadcasted this thing, and it was this big sort of like rallying point for the whole city, where everyone said, look, we have gotten through the first year of this hell, And, here we are, still producing art, still producing a record of how it is that we are actually human. And the amazing thing is that years later, the conductor who had conducted this performance in Leningrad itself, he was approached by some German tourists, and they said to him, "Look, we were actually in the trenches on the other side of the walls there, and they said that night we heard that symphony." They said, and that was the night we realized we would never take the city of Leningrad. So it was really a deeply moving thing for the people of that city, and they still are very, very proud of this symphony.
Wow.
Oh, sorry. That was actually a very long way of saying I read this article in The Guardian about that, and about the musicians who remained from that original orchestra. They brought them back together. They were now like in their 80s and 90s. Then they had them play again. There were only a few of them, but anyway, it was a very moving article.
Wow. Huh. Well, I mean, are you, I guess just to round the whole conversation out, are you doing any other works of nonfiction right now, or are you going to sort of put that aside for a while?
No, the next thing I'm going to be doing is actually a graphic novel adaptation of a medieval epic. So I'll be doing that with Candlewick as well.
Excellent, excellent. Oh,
Yeah.
Can you say what it is, or are you going to keep it under wraps for now?
No. It's an epic called Yvain, or Yvain, by an author named Chrétien de Troyes, and it's neat because he was the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So he was writing for one of the most powerful women in Europe at the time, and one of the reasons why it really attracts me as the original, why it attracted me, is this idea that we have a lot of discussion now going on about the whole sort of like Game of Thrones and high fantasy thing of how is it that you treat women in a medieval fantasy world. And one of the interesting things is that this is a text which acknowledges its female characters, and shows the ways that they have power, which they exercise, but also sort of sympathizes with them about the ways that they don't have power. So it's a really, really kind of like moving, peculiar text. And so what we decided to do is that the illustrator, we specifically wanted to have a female illustrator.
Oh.
And so the idea is that the words sort of tell the male story, the illustrations are supposed to pick up some of the irony that the original author inserted in, and show that this is really not just a story about a dude in armor, but is also about the women who he's totally screwing over the whole time, and who are actually sort of resisting him in certain ways.
That's great. And who's the artist? Can you say?
Her name is Andrea Offerman, and she is, you would know her from her covers, but I think this might be the first book where she has done interiors in this country.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I mean, that's...
Well, thank you.
That's all the questions I have. This sounds, I mean, Symphony for the City of the Dead sounds fantastic. I will just repeat that it's coming out in September. I believe it's September 22nd, so people should look for it then. And thank you so much for talking to me.
No, thanks for talking to me.
No problem. We'll see you around.
Okay.